Okay, so this is 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks since the last vlog. Some good progress, which this video is just pretty much going to be all about. A bit of development around the idea, a bit of development around the story, and mainly a good start on the sort of design process and the whole look and aesthetic and how I'm going to be building this up. So yeah, we can get a look at this now. Okay, so the first thing that I did pretty much off the bat, almost before I posted the last vlog, was make up my schedule for the next however many months. This is just basically, well, it's quite straightforward if you just looking at it. As you can see, I've worked through the first 3 weeks there. So this is so this is Sunday the 21st, so that is this week here, and I've just finished up the chains and the legs, which you will see. I also animated that first shot, so I just crossed that one off as well. But yeah, I finished off the two captain's designs. I finished off the two exteriors of the ship for all the shots that require the exteriors, and then drawn and animated the first shot with the chains and the legs. See if we can jump in and have a look at what those look like and how I have gone about designing them. So yes, as you've seen, the first two things that I was doing was the character designs. I thought that the character designs would be a good way to sort of get an idea of what I want them to look like, and that'd be good practice. So if the characters are right, then I can base the whole design around what they look like, and just I thought it'd be a good place to start essentially. So this is the first one that I did. This was the pirate captain. You can sort of see where all the sort of inspirations are coming from, the sort of cell shaded cracked wood look of his face. I've heard it kind of makes him look like a zombie, and I don't really mind that that's the aesthetic of it, but it's not like it's meant to be like a undead character. It's just that's the aesthetic of the sort of rough and ready, almost bone wood look. So I'm happy with how that looks. I was in general quite happy with how he turned out. I'll break down, I'll go into the sort of layers and show you where this all sort of came from. So I started off with his face. Let's see if I break down all these layers. So yeah, I started off with a sketch. I was taking a sort of inspiration from this top character here in the top left, which is Blackbeard from Pirates of the Caribbean, I think. That sort of shot was pretty much what I was going for. I liked the hat, the pirate hat, and the big beard and all sort of stuff. Again, the quintessential sort of Blackbeard pirate captain, but obviously putting my own twist on it. So I took these first two images just to get the perspectives right, and then went in ahead and did a sort of sketch, adding in the aspects that I wanted that in, like the eye patch and the headband and stuff like that. As you can see from the offset, I had these sharp cheekbones, and that was a sort of idea that came about from the angular sort of style of Blackwater Gospel characters, which I will show you here. So you can see the sort of angular face and stuff on the Blackwater Gospel characters, which I just really like the style of. It's probably closer to this guy than anything, but they all sort of have these really angular features, and his cheekbones are really high and stuff like that. I really like that idea. I just really thought it added a bit of character to everything. So yeah, that was one of the first things. But his nose, I was just having this sort of cartoony big parody nose and stuff like that. And then as I developed out the lines and the shapes, I ended up breaking it down into more of this angular nose and more angular beard and mouth shapes and stuff like that. And his eye patch went from a circular to a square and stuff, just because I quite liked how the aesthetic was turning out, and I thought it worked quite well with the whole wooden texture that I was going for. So from there, then the base of the face came. It's locked. This was the original shape that I was essentially sketching over from my Illustrator file. So after I took that, once I was happy with the lines, I just sort of kept the lines and started filling in the textures and the colours. I've taken my colour palette across all of my files. So this is the original colour palette I was going from. Just took it from all the different footage that I was getting, and I like this blue greeny blue down the bottom is my sort of, so this green I use in my sort of branding and my Instagram and my website and all that sort of CV, business card stuff. So I liked the idea of having this blue throughout the whole project, because then it matches everything and it's quite nice and succinct. The rest of them, the red and the greys and the browns, these are all going to be the shades of the colours of the wood and of the characters' skins and stuff. But started off with this colour palette and filling in his face with those, and then started just adding layers on top. So I would take all the layers and layer it on top, and then use an eraser just to add the textures and add the that sort of grungy look that I was going for. So that's pretty much how I've been developing all these things, and I won't break down every single asset creation, because this is the same process that I've used throughout all of them. So yeah, adding layers on top and erasing, and adding more depth, erasing more. So with places I wanted the highlights, I would erase more. All the places I wanted the, that sort of way, and just start adding more and more layers. And then eventually, once I was happy with that sort of aesthetic, I would go over all the lines and just make them heavier, make them more cel shaded looking, and that just adds a lot of strength to the assets and the characters. And then from there, I would add in the detail of the lines, all the cracks and all that sort of stuff. This obviously falls in quite nicely with strengthening the lines and makes the character bold and heavy and all that sort of good stuff. And then I would go on and add in the shading details. So where the light was coming from, this character's always going to have that light hitting him from this side. So I was adding in the shading details, and that adds a lot more again. I wouldn't necessarily use I try and use texture brushes, the same sort of texture that I was using all over his beard and his face, to add the shading, as well as, and then I doubled that up, doubling it up just made it a bit heavier and grungier, and then added in the highlights again, using the texture brushes where I wanted some highlights. I doubled up those highlights a few times, I think, but what I'm planning later on is for this character to be not hit, but lit up with a big flash of lightning. So I've got the idea of, just strengthening the highlights whenever that flashes in his face. So I've got another option there for the highlights. And then went in and started, because obviously one of the mouth and the eye, there's not a lot of sort of animation going to be happening in his face. That's not really the idea that I'm going for here. I'm not going for full character animation and stuff, but I would like in 2 different shots for his expression to be different. So in the first shot, he will be slightly further away from the camera, and as the camera zooms in, I wanted to make his eye squint and add a bit more detail into that eye, just so that whenever it zooms into about here, maybe a bit further out actually, but whenever it zooms in, there's a bit more detail in his eye and he's squinting and stuff, and that's whenever I'm hoping to have the flash of lightning just to light him up. So yeah, that was pretty much the development of the face of the character. Added in just some extra shading, and so yeah, overlaid some more textures. So I was just using overlays to add that sort of cloudy texture into his face. Again, adds just another layer of depth, quite like it. And again, another overlay of textures, just keeping to add those details, because if you're zooming in on his face and like this close up, I wanted to have a bit more to look at, a bit more detail on his face, so whenever they get that close up, it looks quite, quite involved. So from there, obviously needed a wee face. This is just a sort of classic smirky grin, chipped, missing teeth, that sort of thing. Now, this character is, I suppose, an anti-hero, which is something I'll get into a bit later, just the idea of the characters in the story. But basically what I was going for here was, I'm going to win this fight, and he doesn't know what's coming. That was the whole look I was going for here. So he's a bit of a cheeky guy, but yeah, I'll get more into the sort of where the story's going later on. And then from there, if I go, so yeah, I obviously put the hat around his face, but I was developing out the hat. Just want this rough and ready looking leather look in his hat. I won't break down how I've done all the same steps, because I've just used the same idea, the layers, the lines, the textures and the highlights and shading, same process through all my assets. But this was then the hat that I was going to be adding to him. Went into his clothing. Now the clothing is hidden in quite a lot of the shot, so I didn't really need to go too much into it, just because the big wheel's going to be in front of him and it gets completely cut off in the second shot. So with the amount of layering and rain effects coming in as well. It doesn't need to be that detailed, it just needs to have some sort of colour, some sort of shape. So yeah, going through all that, this was the display. This is my finished character. Now you will have a moving arm that's attached to the wheel, and his left arm will be attached to the wheel and his right arm will just be out of shot. But whenever I'm doing the wheel, I want those things to be attached to it, so this character will pretty much be as is. But yeah, I'll get into sort of where I'm going with the animation style a bit later on in this video. Okay, so I'll just jump through the rest of the assets here. This is the Royal Captain. So the British Royal Navy Captain outfit is well known. It's Pirates of the Caribbean, it's whatever you want to see it in. You know what it looks like, but navy and blue. Navy and gold. So you see this character and you go, right, cool. This shot is him looking out over his deck on his wheel again. With how I've made everything, they're all different, separate entities, separate assets. So I could have his ponytail maybe waving a little bit in the wind. That's all happy enough. But yeah, again, happy with how this guy turned out. And adding to the colour palette now. So I'm adding the sort of blues and the golds that I'm using throughout the sort of royal, the royal ship, and obviously the royal characters. Okay, and then moving into the ships. Straight away you see that I've used the same gold and blue that I had in the Royal Captain, just because I wanted the character of the ship to match to mirror the character of the captains, essentially. The way I've done this is exactly the same sort of breakdown as the captain, sorry, but obviously all separate entities, so all the sails can have the slight wind effects I talked about in the previous video. The sail itself is just a flat 2D image, which I've added a shape to here, but it can be animated. The water and the effects are obviously not painted on, but I'm currently developing how to make those move and all that sort of good stuff. With the lack of animation, it's like full animation, the rear of the ship and the side of the ship are two separate assets, and all the sails are in different layers. So with slight perspective warping, obviously it can't go too extreme because they are 2D assets, but you can have two extremes. You can slightly warp it at another like 5 degrees right or 5 degrees left without making it look too mental, and that way I can use the same assets in two different shots and make them just look slightly different. I could just keep the same ship in both shots, like it works that way, but I would quite like to make a slight shift just to line up a bit nicer, but it works just because everything is built in different layers and assets within Photoshop. They can be slightly warped, and that gives me the option to use them twice. But yeah, if you look in closer, you don't get too much of a close-up of this shot, but there is quite a nice little bit of detail in here, and I think that turned out quite nicely. Just using the references of the royal ships, I've slightly changed up the shape of the back, but the idea is the same. In terms of the gold filigree and the rear windows and the shape of the back, it's a classic ship of the line for the British Navy back in the 17th century, and easily recognizable, but in my style. So happy enough with how it turned out. And then moving on to the pirate ship. So this one was the most recent one I did, only like a couple of days ago, but using the same sail assets but changing the shape and the color of them, using the same sort of perspective, but obviously changing the ship entirely. So yeah, this ship is obviously quite heavily inspired by a lot of the Pirates of the Caribbean stuff, the very extreme, elaborate, detailed pirate ships that you wouldn't really find back in the day, like the big sculptures in the back of them and the heavily inlaid wood and all sorts of stuff. I did obviously want to put my own spin on it, and as you can see, this is how it's turned out. Now, this did take a few attempts, and the ships did take a lot longer than I expected, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. The sail is something that I have noted to work on, because it's a cool looking sail, but doesn't quite fit my aesthetic of the strong bold black lines and the strong shapes. So I'm probably going to be looking into doing that a bit different and a bit, looking into doing that a bit different, but something down the line, obviously on my mind. But this is the pirate ship, the Victory, or the Freedom, sorry, as I'm calling it. And again, all the same sort of layered, so it could be slightly warped and slightly perspective warped. the sail can be animated, and all the big sails, or the flag can be animated, and all the sails can be slightly animated. So happy enough with how that has turned out. Obviously using all the same techniques that I had used in the first character creation. And yeah, one thing I do want to talk about is the sort of aesthetic that you're seeing around it. This is what I'm aiming for. You can see the blues. If I pop up my palette again, you can see that this blue is what I'm using for the water and the sky, and it then falls quite nicely into my company, or sorry, my personal branding. Okay, so one thing that I've discussed with my lecturers over the past couple of weeks is the nature of the characters and the nature of the story. As I sort of talked about in the first vlog, the whole idea of the pirates rescuing the slaves is a very romanticized idea in terms of what it was probably like back in the day. They probably didn't just rescue them for the sake of it. It is a story that's been sort of thrown into cultural references in the past couple of years from games like Assassin's Creed and from the Black Flag series. It sort of throws a twist on who is the good guy, who is the bad guy. If you look at that ship, you'd sort of think, right, that's a scary looking ship. It's quite spooky looking, and it's got the pirate flag, and you instantly think bad guy, right? But also, if you were to look at the pirate captain, he's got more rounded features. He does have the spikier face, but overall, the more rounded shoulders, the rounder hat, stuff like that, with a cheeky smile, it sort of throws a sort of spanner in the works, thinking this guy looks a more friendly character. And then whenever you look back at the royal captain and the victory, you don't necessarily think that the bad guy. You just think this is the British Navy, right? The idea of the pirates then coming and rescuing the captors, or the captives, the idea is sort of leaving it up to the interpretation of the audience on that. The final shot of the pirate ship sailing off in the distance with the broken chains, I didn't really necessarily want it to be, because it was discussed, like, you know, showing the captives getting onto the pirate ship, or showing the British losing the fight and stuff like that. It was more a case of, I wanted to show that the chains had been broken. That was really all I wanted to show. The first shot is the people walking down the deck in the chains, and the last shot is showing the chains being broken and the pirates sailing off into the horizon. It could be interpreted as the British have captured a pirate, and the pirates are chasing after them to essentially take that pirate back, because the pirates, obviously, piracy was illegal. So the British, in your eyes, could be the good guys taking the pirates and, you know, going behind them for piracy. In which case the pirate ship is the enemy, the antagonist. Or you could look at it as the persons in chains are the slaves, and the pirates are coming to take the take the British ship. Just because they're pirates, and they're coming to attack the ship, and whenever they attack the ship, they find that they are carrying slaves, and instead of killing them, or instead of, you know, whatever, they break the chains and they free them. But what I didn't want to, because I was struggling with this in the last shot, I didn't want whoever was in the chains, I didn't want them to become a victim of this scenario. I wanted them to either be, I wanted them to be freed, essentially. That was the whole idea of it. It will be up to the interpretation of the audience who is the antagonist, who is the protagonist, or if there is neither. Because obviously the pirates are still pirates, they're performing illegal acts, but the British could be the antagonists because the person in chains was a slave. It could be thrown either way. I just wanted the final shot to be this person that has been freed. You choose. Okay, so moving on to sort of animation aspect of all this animation major project. The because I'm not really the stuff I sort of do is mainly simple motion graphics in work anyway. So I wanted to sort of expand my skill set, but at the same time not focus on heavily rigged characters and all that sort of full character animation, all that sort of stuff. But one thing that I've seen quite a lot through social media and quite a lot just in general in some of the sort of World of Warcraft stuff that I've seen is this sort of parallax animation, so using set assets to make, like, for example, out of oil paintings, making them feel animated, bringing them to life again, which is something that is what I want to achieve essentially throughout all of the shots in my animation. So if we watch this short video here, see they're all still images being brought to life through the use of just cutting the layers and adding simple animation to them, but bringing them really to life in that sense. Obviously it makes it a lot easier because I'm making the assets, but that's the sort of idea that I want to achieve and everything. So whenever you look back at this sort of shot, or probably better off if you go into, so yeah, if we have a look at the Illustrator and keep in mind that idea of the parallax effect, if I had, for example, this layer here, the main captain would have very simple head tilt shift, and then the wheel in front of him would rotate. His arm is going to be a separate asset attached to this cog on the wheel, and then that limits the whole animation but brings the whole scene to life. Obviously you can layer behind, you can have the sail waving in the background, you can have a slight movement with the waves on the boat, that sort of idea. So by layering all these different 2D layers and adding quite simple motion to them, you can really bring an entire image to life again. So that's the effect I want to achieve essentially throughout this process, throughout all the animation, is this cool parallax. And I think it'll be greatest displayed in this particular shot whenever there's an explosion and there's the multiple layers and the different fragments and cannons in the background flying and cannonballs coming through. All those layers of parallaxed animation makes for a really full and really lively scene essentially. Yeah. Okay, so moving on from the sort of idea of the parallax animation, I did want to still have some aspects of 2D traditional animation. The style that I quite liked the most, or the one that I had in my head, was just sort of 2D traditional. Now, I quite like the idea of having the first scene, the one with the legs walking, being quite a well developed animation, and I thought that the best way to do it, make it as good looking as possible, was to do it by rotoscoping essentially, but then adding my style to the finished piece. So started off by filming just a couple of walks in the wide angle, if you think of the first shot, with the wide angled low angle shot of the feet walking forward. So just filmed that myself, and then broke down all the frames, put it into Photoshop, into all the different layers of all the different frames. Ended up being about 106 frames for the first 8 seconds of the footage, well, roughly 8 seconds. And then from there, I just started adding on did the lines around all the shapes of the feet for all the frames. So just, going frame by frame, adding the lines, all sort of stuff. Where I could, if it didn't move too much, I would just keep the same lines, slightly warp them, did it that way. Then from there, I started to fill in textures. So what I did was, for the texture, was I jumped into another project file here and just made essentially what would be texture files. So you can see just the rectangles with the shading in the middle, which I was using to line up with the leg. Made the two different textures, one for the right leg, one for the left leg, and then essentially brought these pictures in to my build and mapped them on for every frame for both legs. Quite a tedious project, quite a tedious process, but again, just lining up the sort of highlights in the back of the tendon and lining up the calf with the scars and just warping or manipulating or shaping them for every single frame. And if it got a bit too warped, I just remap another layer and just make sure that it always looked high quality and essentially just mapped it for every single layer. And then obviously did that for both legs. And then as you can see, because of that, this leg essentially was the first frame that I took, and then started mapping around that. So you can see that the base of the foot doesn't have a texture map, and I did, obviously with the base of the foot being on a dirty ship deck, it was going to be a different texture. I wasn't just going to have the same one. I could use shading later on, but I thought I'd just have a different texture. That would make my life a bit easier. But also had a nice effect, because obviously the bottom of the feet is going to be dirty. So again, jumped into my other texture file and added this sort of dirty wooden brown colour to the base, so I could then jump into all my frames again and map this wooden layer to the base of my feet for every single shot where the base is shown. And then that worked for every single layer for both feet. Just keep reshaping, remapping. It doesn't need to be too close with that, because obviously it's very hard to see it and it's going to be even shaded anyway. But I thought I'd have it anyway because it adds a bit of texture. And then what I was thinking was, these guys are obviously walking bare feet on a deck of a ship. They probably haven't had whatever for months, haven't had any cover on their feet for months. So there's probably going to be some sort of cutting and blood on the bottom of their feet. So I added this small textured blood file, or texture. Quite rough. It doesn't need to be too high detail because it's not. It's going to be constantly moving and it's going to be shaded, but I just wanted to have that texture in there to add a bit more depth and a bit more detail. So again, went through every single layer and added blood to both the heels, which again was just mapping that rounded shape with what would be the bottom of their heel. I did that for every single frame for both legs. Again, quite a long process, but it turned out really, really well. So yeah, once I had done that, textured the legs, textured the blood, textured the base of the feet for every single frame in that first 8 seconds, I then went back into the same files. As you can see, I've broken it down into different, I've done frame 151 to 75 just so the files didn't get too big. But I went back in, and obviously there's going to be chains around the legs. So what I did was I made a hook, if I can hide those. So what I did was I made a small sort of metal textured rectangle with a small hook with the black lines around the outside, and then I brought those into my files and shaped them around the ankles in the perspective. As it moved along, the perspective is obviously going to change. Just perspective worked and arched them for every single frame and just move between them, just sort of easy traditional animation. And then put the reverse on the back side of the foot, so it always looked like it's looping around. Again, broke that down, just did that frame by frame for all the frames on both legs. And then once I had that done, I came back in, I exported all these files and just exported all the legs and got rid of all the layers to shorten my file sizes down, and then jumped in to a different file, made a small floor and added the chains in between. So with the chains, what I essentially did was I took a point at which the legs were going to be roughly the same distance from the camera and made a small hook shape, just textured and shaded as a chain loop essentially, and put that between my hook. And I always made sure that in order to keep the perspective the same, because I knew that this hook changed size proportionally to the legs, so I always knew that as long as the width of this chain matched the width of that hoop, the chain would essentially be in the right perspective. And I made each of these a separate asset and connected the loop with the weight that I felt like was right and the distance that I felt that was right between the legs, and essentially just went through every single frame and changed each of these chain loops to match the motion and warp the size and the perspective for each frame so that the weight of the chain matched the movement of the legs. So went through, as I say, broke down that into frame by frame, changed the perspective of the chain and moved it forward, and then added this fake floor in the same sort of perspective as this, just because I knew that that was what the flat foot was going to be. And yeah, so what I essentially achieved out of it was this textured walk cycle with the chain in the middle, in the style that I liked. I was doing my project in this sort of cell shaded rough look, and I think I will show you now how it turned out. So yeah, I think that turned out quite well. I'll probably be adding, like, shading with the rest of the scene just to make sure it's all succinct, and adding a bit more darkness under the bottoms of the foot and wherever the light's coming from. Once I get the full scene developed, I can add a bit more shading and all that sort of stuff into that. But yeah, really happy with how it turned out. I quite like it, and yeah, I'm really quite happy with it. So, moving on from this week. I'm back onto deck assets. So, going to be fleshing out that scene essentially in the first shot, fleshing out the sort of surrounding assets, but for all the scenes. So that will be for the surrounding wood and the floor and the ropes, and I'll probably be putting changing this car. I was going to do a different character walking in front, but just because of time, I think I'm going to be putting a soldier holding a sword, like the guy is walking up to the soldier and stopping at him, because it works quite well with the walk cycle. Developing the sort of small assets you see in the distance here, maybe the ropes on this shot. There's no one back. Then the assets behind this captain, the steering wheel, and then this shot as well. So it's going to be a cannon with maybe just silhouetted 2 sets of eyes for this shot, and the on-deck assets also covers some of the stuff in this shot, but not all of them, because I've got that plotted in for the next bit. And then some of these assets as well. So just the smaller assets that don't move and don't have to do that much with. It's just that they're going to be fleshing out the scenes of more detailed assets, as opposed to the filler assets and the painted backdrops, which will be very non-detailed assets in the backgrounds and stuff like that, just to fill up the parallax 2D effect. But yeah. So yeah, that's where I'm at the minute. Hope you can sort of see this idea coming together, because I can see the sort of style coming through, and I'm really fleshing out the look of it all, and quite happy with it, where it's going, quite happy with the story, quite happy with everything around it, really. So just need to get my head down and keep working on it. But yeah, guess I'll catch you in the next one.